Hello and welcome. My name is Ben, and this is a book review for Neil Gaiman's American Gods. It's a very much talked about work of Neil Gaiman's, and he's the same author of Stardust fame, including the book that was made into a movie, and also the Sandman graphic novel. And very well-known author, very good author. And this book is recommended by the Washington Post, George R.R. Martin, Steve Erickson, Jonathan Carroll, the Seattle Times, New York Times, all basically applauded it as a wonderful book. What is it about? Well, I'm going to read the blurb on the back, and what it says is, it's very short. Released from prison, Shadow finds his world turns upside down. His wife has been killed and a mysterious stranger offers him a job. But Mr. Wednesday, who offered him a job, who knows more about Shadow than is possible, warns that a storm is coming, a battle for the very soul of America, and they are in its direct path. One of the most talked about books of the new millennium, American Gods is a kaleidoscope journey deep into the myth and across American landscape, at the once eerily familiar and utterly alien. It is quite simple. It is quite simply a contemporary masterpiece. Alright. Does the blurb on the back really match? It's really a teaser blurb. It's not actually a really description book. Okay, so Shadow is the main character of the book. And as discussed, he basically is just released from prison and finds out that his wife has died and doesn't really have much to live for. Mr. Wednesday, who you soon find out is actually a old god, just like the book title, American Gods. Let's see if I can show as many possible cuts of the book. That way I might be able to wind up with a thumbnail that I can post. Is an old god. Mr. Wednesday is Odin, and was basically transported to America as part of, along with all the new immigrants who basically believed in him, right? And there are various other gods in America, all who basically have either been created here or were brought here from the old world. And the storm is coming. What is that? That's the teaser on the back. Well, there are new gods in America. There's, fast food, there's the internet, there's TV, there's all the things that basically we as Americans are basically, elevating to the level of godship by basically worshiping in them today. That's the real power. And so it's a little bit of an adventure book in the sense that Shadow, the main character, gets a job catering to and chauffeuring around Odin while he goes and he visits different old gods and new gods and everything like that. And it's sort of a what's going to happen? Is a battle between the old and the new going to happen? Is Mr. Wednesday, is he going to switch to the new side? So you're just sort of taken along on this pretty much adventure, and I think that's really where the writing style of Neil Gaiman really works well. Is that he is a very good author, and the writing is very good in this book, and you kind of get taken along for the ride. In other words, there's not a lot of fluff in the novel. It's like many times the prose is sort of understated. The dialogue is sort of understated because the story is moving along without the need to sort of bolster it along with dialogue. The story is moving along, and really like quite a bit of the novel is set to basically describe the different American settings. These sort of places of worship now that are, sort of semi-romantic, little American sideshows, like the times that you would go and see a five and dime sort of freak show at an American road show, that sort of thing is like, that's where the casting off of rationale and logic has been made of them. They're willing to believe that the two-headed calf is somehow like this prophetical, like, amazing thing, right? And so that's sort of like some of the shrines of American worship, is like these places where people were willing to believe. It's the Barnum and Bailey's or Ripley's Believe It or Not sideshow, Barnum Bailey's Come and See the Bearded Lady, that sort of thing. Even though those are not actually in here dressed by names, he basically uses different examples, and actually probably from what he's did of the research, real examples of kind of Americana road venues. I don't know what they call them. Basically, you drive down a little teeny highway and it says, "Come and see the world's biggest cowbell," and those kinds of road attractions. That would be a good word, attractions. Anyway, this book took me a month to read, and this is actually, I would say, big writing. It's not a large book. It's about 500 pages, but the writing is very large. The text is very large and readable, and it took me a long time to read because I didn't like the book. I thought it was actual shit. I didn't like it at all, and it basically centers around the main character. Now, this is sort of an interesting thing if you think about it in a larger scope, that this is good writing, actually, but it's a bad story. Like, good writing does not equal bad story. Like, on the flip side, I guess I would make the example of Stephenie Meyer's Twilight. Fairly good story up until the end, but shitty writing, and like had a lot of problems. And don't get me started about the Twilight novel, because it was actually Twilight series, because it was terrible. But it did capture something, which is why it was successful. I mean, can you pick it out? Can you tell me why Twilight was a successful series? It doesn't necessarily, it's not because, stupid dreamy girls. It actually touched something on a deeper level. Anyway, that would be a book review for Twilight. But yeah, excellent writing, fairly good, I think, premise, but I think there's really a poor execution of that premise in the plot. The premise is that there's some sort of internal backstage intrigue between basically these gods who are trying to vie for, worship from your average American citizen, and your average American citizen is sort of fickle, moving on to the next great thing. So TV is going to die to internet, and who knows what internet's going to die for. But the main character, and my main complaint with the book, is the main character, Shadow, who basically sort of is a non-entity. Like, he doesn't actually have very much of a volition of his own. His taking the job was sort of a, what do I got to lose? It was a reactionary move. And he doesn't really necessarily present a lot of volition or presence in the entire book, up until basically where, like, the end, where he has to basically do something, because otherwise the book would just have a terrible ending. And the book does end on a pretty, it has an interesting sense in that there's no separation between basically the ending of the story and sort of the epilogue. So the ending sort of ties up the story, and you get to see sort of like what ends up happening in this situation between the old gods and the new gods, and why the conflict is there and where it's going. And then there's also basically a storyline of basically, okay, show's over, what's Shadow gonna do now? That sort of thing. Which is more of a sort of an epilogue that isn't it isn't strictly divided from the rest of the story like most fantasy books. But it just is interesting to me that like the main character, because he's not very soulful, doesn't have a lot of presence, doesn't have a lot of personality, he just never grabbed my attention. Like, I kind of plodded through the book because I just didn't care. And if you kind of review like sort of Shadow's personality, he's not like sort of a cliche book. And I think that a lot of people, like, this is not the book for me. I think a lot of people will like this book. It's a book that I could probably recommend, to the sense that if you don't like books that I like, you might like this book because it is really written well, and maybe you like the fact that the story is not very in-depth, and it's just sort of watch the adventure sort of happen, rather than sort of a bring the reader in and put them on the spot of like, do they really care about the character? What would they do in that situation? There wasn't a lot of that sort of tension that I like when I read books. Ooh, at 10 minutes. Okay. I think another really weak point for me in the book was the settings, the roadside attractions that were featured so much in the descriptions and the details, and that really binded the book together. And I think that they did a good job of binding the book together. But unlike possibly some European or British author that is new, moved to America and decided that all of these little quaint roadside attractions are really, you know, romantic in their own little way. You know, the fact that we have these quirky little, like, see the largest cowbell, isn't that so quaint and quirky? Isn't that a manifestation of romantic America? Okay, for me, I think that those places are like complete shoddy crap, and that they're basically, you know, scams, which they are, which on a, you know, a metaphorical level, on another level, the idea that those things are kind of, those roadside attractions are sham, kind of reaches into a different metaphorical level. If you read the book, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But I don't find any sort of romanticism in those kind of roadside attractions at all, okay? Like, when I was a kid, my dad's idea of a good time was everybody pile in the car and let's drive 5 miles to the middle of nowhere, stop for nothing, eat, you know, lunch, late lunch, turn around, drive 5 hours back. And that was like our entertainment for our Saturday or our weekend, you know. I was lucky if I stopped at some of these roadside attractions, and really they are shitty, you know. They are just basically shams, and you know, I don't find anything romantic in them at all. Because that's what I did when I was a kid, you know. It was fish hatcheries, the Maritime Museum, and see the largest cowbell, go and see like some 5 and dime leftovers 1950s roadside attraction with basically, you know, fiberglass dinosaurs, you know. It was that sort of experience. And I just don't find anything intriguing about it at all. And like, I would really much rather see the attractions and history and the in-depth nature of going into Europe and being like, shit, this is where the Battle of the Bulge happened, or man, there's this gigantic cathedral that took 200 years to build and has been here despite the fact that this country didn't even exist, you know, when this cathedral was built, you know. Like, as far as, you know, somebody from Europe, I don't know why he centered the settings on these sort of romanticized, contrived, sham-like roadside attractions. Was he trying to say something about America, that we do have like no history, and so our ideas of romanticism are rather in tatters, you know? I think there's a lot of metaphorical goo that you could sort of get out of this book, but for me it doesn't really make it worth it. And the ending, although I think it did tie things together, was not a rewarding payoff to stick with the main character, who really had no, you know, real personality through, you know, 3/4 of the book. I just wasn't engaged. It took me forever to read. The epilogue did not add anything necessarily that was entirely epic. In fact, there is a part where the main character could have died in the epilogue, and instead he got a free pass, and I think it would have been much more interesting had you just clocked him and just took him out, you know, because he's already finished his main goal. I mean, the story is over, you know, and because he doesn't necessarily have a personality, there's not a lot of, you know, there wasn't a lot of reader attachment to me, and it's not like, you know, you really want to, you know, cheer him on, you know. I think it would have been a much more interesting story, and also because this is a fantasy story, you could have, you know, you could have wiped him out and then carried along, you know, maybe his association with Odin has given him access to sort of immortality that the gods experience. You know, there's a lot of different ways that they could have, like, went with that, because this is a fantasy story, you know. You could have clocked him and even, like, you know, elevated him to, like, a different level. I mean, his name is Shadow, after all. I mean, it's kind of portentous in itself. But they didn't. And so I would not recommend this book. If you do not like any of the books I like, then I might suggest this book. I regret reading it, so it would be a 4. I don't think it's a bad book, so that's why it's not a 3. It's on the verge of where I'm like, I don't like this book, but the writing is too good for me to say that it's a bad book. The writing is actually good. I just don't like the story, the plot. I think the premise is solid, but the execution of it I think is terrible, and a really draining main character. So that's all I have to say about Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later.